As the 1840s approached, the United States found itself navigating a precarious balance between growth and internal tension. The nullification crisis, though resolved, had left enduring marks on the national psyche. It was a warning. Even a young democracy, expanding across a vast continent, could be tested from within. Americans carried a memory of near conflict in 1832 like a shadow over every debate about federal authority, economic policy, and regional interests. In South Carolina, political discourse remained charged. Leaders and citizens alike continued to discuss the principles of states' rights, and the doctrine of nullification became a foundational element of Southern political thought. Town halls, newspapers, and churches became forums for debating the proper relationship between state and federal power. Every new law, every tariff adjustment, every decision from Washington was scrutinized through the lens of 1832. Citizens remembered how close their state had come to outright confrontation and remained vigilant, believing they could and should defend their autonomy whenever necessary. For Andrew Jackson, the crisis remained a defining moment of his presidency. He had acted decisively, preserving the Union and asserting the authority of the executive branch, but he knew that the challenges of governance were far from over. In personal correspondence, he reflected on the fragility of compromise and the need for vigilance against forces that might seek to divide the nation. Jackson's legacy, shaped by his response to nullification, became a template for strong presidential leadership, emphasizing the necessity of decisive action in the face of defiance. John C. Calhoun's influence, meanwhile, grew stronger in the South. His writings on states' rights were widely circulated, studied, and cited by political leaders and ordinary citizens alike. Calhoun had transformed nullification from a one-time political maneuver into a broader ideological framework. By articulating a vision in which states could resist federal authority when necessary, he provided a roadmap that would later justify secession and shape the Southern political identity for generations. The crisis had elevated him into a symbol of principle, courage, and regional pride. Henry Clay, although less celebrated in the public imagination, continued to demonstrate the value of diplomacy. His compromise had prevented immediate violence and preserved the Union, but he knew that long-term solutions require continuous negotiation and foresight. Clay's work highlighted the necessity of moderation, compromise, and pragmatism in governance, a reminder that even the most volatile conflicts could be managed without bloodshed if approached with skill and vision. The economic disparities between North and South, first exposed by the nullification crisis, continued to deepen. Northern industries thrived under protective tariffs, expanding rapidly and generating new wealth and political influence. Southern economies, relying on agriculture and slave labor, felt increasingly marginalized, their economic interests often at odds with national policies. This growing divide reinforced regional identities, sowed seeds of resentment, and created fertile ground for the ideological conflicts that would erupt in the decades to come. The crisis also left a profound human impact. Families in the South lived with a memory of potential conflict, aware that political disputes could escalate into violence. Farmers worried about tariffs affecting their profits. Merchants feared economic instability. Enslaved people, still trapped in bondage, remained vulnerable to the threats of political unrest and military mobilization. Across the nation, citizens recognized that national politics were not abstract. They carried real consequences for everyday life, livelihoods, and security. Media and public opinion played a critical role in shaping the legacy of the crisis. Southern newspapers framed nullification as a righteous defense of liberty and sovereignty. Northern newspapers condemned it as rebellion and a threat to national unity. These competing narratives reinforced regional identities, solidified ideological divides, and ensured that the events of 1832 will remain a touchstone for political debate, education, and public discourse for decades. The nullification crisis also influenced the evolving role of the presidency. Jackson's actions demonstrated the capacity of the executive branch to enforce federal law decisively, setting a precedent for future leaders. At the same time, his assertiveness sparked debate about the limits of presidential authority and the proper balance between federal power and state sovereignty. These debates became a recurring theme in American political life, shaping the development of the nation's governance structures and influencing the strategies of leaders for generations. As the country expanded westward, acquiring new territories and incorporating new states, the ideological tensions exposed by the nullification crisis became increasingly pronounced. Debates over the extension of slavery tariffs and states' rights were informed by the experiences of 1832. The crisis had demonstrated that unresolved disputes over federal authority could fester, creating conditions for future conflict. The ideological seeds planted during the nullification crisis would eventually blossom into the sectional divisions that culminated in the Civil War. The lessons of the crisis extended beyond policy and law. They were lessons about human behavior, leadership, and the delicate balance of democracy. Jackson's decisiveness illustrated the importance of courage and resolve. Clay's diplomacy showed the value of negotiation and pragmatism. Calhoun's advocacy highlighted the enduring power of ideas and the potential for principled resistance. Together, their actions shaped the nation's understanding of governance, authority, and the responsibilities of both leaders and citizens. Even decades later, historians would look back on the nullification crisis as a critical moment in the evolution of the United States. It was the first major confrontation between state and federal authority, a test of the Constitution, and a demonstration of the fragility of national unity. It revealed the dangers of unchecked ideology, the importance of compromise, and the role of leadership in shaping the course of history. Ultimately, the nullification crisis was more than a political dispute over tariffs. It was a profound test of the American experiment itself, a confrontation that asked whether a young nation, defined by diverse regional interests, could survive internal discord. It was a story of human ambition, principle, courage, and compromise. It was a story of a nation confronting itself, almost tearing itself apart, and learning the difficult lessons necessary to endure. The streets of Charleston, South Carolina, in the early 1830s were alive with tension. Merchants argued loudly about trade and tariffs. Dock workers whispered about the rising prices that threatened their livelihoods. Plantation owners met behind closed doors to discuss what the federal government might force upon them next. Cotton, the lifeblood of the South, seemed to dictate every conversation. Every bale stacked on the docks, every shipment prepared for New York or Liverpool, was a reminder of the stakes at hand. To the people of South Carolina, the Tariff of 1828, mockingly called the Tariff of Abominations, was more than a financial burden. It was an insult, a sign that the North had taken control and was willing to use law and policy to strangle Southern prosperity. Inside Charleston's grand halls, the debate became feverish. Delegates representing towns and counties argued passionately, waving papers, pounding tables, and demanding action. Some warned of rebellion. Some pleaded for patience. And then came the decisive vote. South Carolina declared that it would nullify the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832. They would refuse to enforce them. In their eyes, it was an act of justice. In Washington, it was a declaration of defiance, a spark that could ignite the first Civil War decades before the nation would be ready to face it. News traveled fast. Carriages delivered letters to neighboring towns. Newspapers in other states published fiery accounts. Political leaders across the country leaned in, tried to gauge the gravity of the situation. In the North, businessmen feared disruption to commerce. In the South, citizens debated whether Jackson would dare to use force. The nation collectively held its breath. Andrew Jackson was furious. He had already survived political battles, duels, and the dangers of war, but the idea that a state could openly challenge federal authority was intolerable. He believed that the Union was indivisible, and he would enforce it with every ounce of his authority. He drafted a proclamation so forceful that it would later be remembered as one of the most passionate defenses of federal law in American history. "Disunion by armed force is treason," Jackson wrote, "and I will uphold the Constitution at all costs." His words were not idle threats. They carried the weight of a man who had led troops in battle and believed deeply in the sanctity of the nation. But Jackson was not acting alone. Behind the scenes, Henry Clay worked tirelessly to craft a compromise that could save the Union without humiliating South Carolina. Clay understood the delicacy of the situation. If Jackson pressed too hard, blood might be shed. If South Carolina backed down too weakly, the state's pride and honor would be lost. Clay's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. gradually reduced the tariffs over a period of years, allowing the South to save face while preserving federal authority. The crisis was not just political, it was deeply human. Farmers worried about their crops. Enslaved people feared the growing militias. Merchants worried about trade disruptions. Each person, each family, was caught in the tension between defiance and survival. Letters crossed the country, carrying worry, speculation, and anger. Political speeches, pamphlets, and newspapers fueled the debate. The nullification crisis had become the nation's first existential test, a struggle between the principles of federal law and the claims of state sovereignty. Jackson's determination and Clay's diplomacy ultimately prevented a violent confrontation. South Carolina accepted the compromise tariff of 1833, and the immediate threat of military action was removed. But the resolution was temporary. Calhoun and his supporters had planted a powerful idea. States could, under certain circumstances, resist the federal government. This principle of nullification would linger, shaping Southern thought and political philosophy for decades to come. As the dust settled, both sides reflected on the lessons of the crisis. For Jackson, it was a validation of the presidency's power and the importance of a strong union. For Calhoun and his followers, it was a demonstration that defiance could be politically viable, a proof of concept for the future. And for ordinary Americans, it was a moment of awareness. Politics could erupt into near violence, and the stakes of ideological disputes were nothing less than the survival of the nation itself. Across the country, historians, politicians, and citizens alike would later describe the nullification crisis as a precursor to the Civil War. It was the first time a state openly challenged federal authority, and it revealed the fault lines that would eventually lead to secession. The issues were complex, intertwined with economics, slavery, and questions of identity. But the lessons were clear. Leadership, courage, and compromise were essential to preserving the Union. Neglect or defiance could bring catastrophe. The nullification crisis also underscored the power of rhetoric and persuasion. Calhoun's writings and speeches became foundational to the doctrine of states' rights. Jackson's proclamations and actions became a model for the assertion of federal authority. Clay's compromise became a demonstration of diplomacy and negotiation at its finest. Each man, through principle, personality, and action, shaped the course of American history in profound and lasting ways. Even as America continued to grow and expand westward, the ideas and tensions from 1832 remained alive. New territories, debates over slavery, and conflicts over tariffs would repeatedly reignite the same questions. Who holds ultimate power in the United States? The federal government or the individual states? Can a nation survive when its members believe fundamentally different principles are just? The nullification crisis did not answer these questions. It postponed them. It offered a temporary solution, a reprieve, but not a permanent reconciliation. For the people of South Carolina, the crisis was a source of pride, a reminder that their state could stand up to the federal government and influence national policy. For people in the North, it was a warning that unchecked defiance could threaten national unity. And for the nation as a whole, it was a demonstration that democracy and federalism are delicate systems, requiring constant vigilance, negotiation, and leadership to survive. The nullification crisis also showed the power of narrative. Newspapers, pamphlets, speeches, and letters created stories that shaped public perception. In the South, nullification was framed as a righteous defense of liberty and sovereignty. In the North, it was portrayed as rebellion and treason. These narratives influenced public opinion and helped cement the divisions that would later erupt into civil war.